Okay, let's get cracking. Welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and today we're getting moving with the groovin' and starting off the first book of the third novel uh, in the Rifters trilogy. It is entitled Behemoth, Book 1, Beta Max, as in the symbol beta. Capital Beta, which is also what is used for Behemoth, the disease created in that Watts used as a plot device in the other Rifters books, which kind of helps kickstart the end of the world, or all civilization as we know it anyway. So previously on. Let's see. Lenny Clark, the nicknamed Meltdown Madonna, uh, as well as just human civilization as it's doing how it do, has basically ended the world. She has effectively killed the world, or at least the North American subcontinent. Um, has done a pretty solid number on that puppy. Uh, Mostly by acting as a vector for Behemoth and spreading it out. Behemoth is the disease that came from the bottom of the sea that happens to live rather effectively in the human body, um, and eventually causes you to deteriorate. Death by a thousand cuts, as they say in the book. But also can get in the soil and outcompete literally everything in our biome by cutting the legs out from under it, by eating all the sulfur. I think that's a reasonable synopsis. Uh, Reasonable synopsis for what's going on there. So, um, and at the very end of the second book, or second novel, Maelstrom, uh, it turns out the corpses, which is the vernacular slang term used in universe for people of a high-ranking corporate bent, um, have basically all, particularly for certain energy companies, the Grid Authority, um, have hidden themselves out under the ocean in the deep, deep sea, which is where rifters generally like to make their home after they've had their heads messed with to enjoy that. Um, Bit too much to go into. You either remember or you don't. If you don't, please see the previous two books, which is easy to do. I've given you a link to provided generously by Peter Watts, the author himself, where you can read all three books for free on his website. It's in the stream description. Go check that out. rifters.com/real/insert name of book.htm. In this case, behemoth.htm. Okay, so I keep saying that this is the first book of the third novel. Shortly into this, Peter Watts will explain that. There is an author's note that covers this. It's kind of silly, but it is what it is. And without further, oh right, I like to cover the covers because Peter Watts has his own verbiage associated with them because he's cool. Let me pull up the description that he has for the picture here, for the cover here. He says for this cover, perhaps the only good thing to arise from Tor's decision to release Behemoth in two separate volumes was the fact that I now had 4 Bruce Jensen covers on my work instead of 3. This is the cover of Behemoth Beta Max, with most of the text cropped out to minimize distraction from the art. Love the luminous jade palette. I do too. Bruce Jensen did some of the other signature covers. Most of my favorites, actually, of the series. Of course, that could be nostalgia and the fact that those are the ones that I have copies of. could be either or. All right. So without further ado, I guess we'll get cracking. As in the beast from the deep. This may or may not be a long one. I don't think this is going to be a long one. It's in fact probably going to be kind of truncated. And incidentally, sorry about the late start. Usually I start like half an hour before now, but shit happens. Things happen. How many more pages? Oh, Jesus, like another 20 to do the next chapter after that. That's why. That's why I had that demarcated. Well, we'll see when we get there. Um, my initial thought or hope uh, is the way things are laid out would allow me to get through certain chunks in uh, certain orders that would be nice and neat. But it turns out it's not going to be that way, and that's okay. I'll deal accordingly. I don't want to drag this one out too much. This actually is somewhat longer than I thought, being clocking in at over 300 pages. For some reason, I thought it was shorter. Actually, it's just at 300 pages. Whatever. The last book is a little longer, I think. Anyway, so without further ado, let's get moving. If you're one of those kind folk who keep setting the timestamps, it's whatever this is at. Thanks. Right here. Behemoth, Book 1, Beta Max, by Peter Watts. In memory of Strange Cat, aka Carcinoma, 1984 to 2003. She wouldn't have cared. Author's Note. Welcome. You hold the further and final adventures of Lenny Clark, the third installment of my Rifters trilogy, in your sweaty little mammalian hands. Well, I do anyway. You don't, maybe. Unfortunately, you don't hold all of it. Behemoth is being released in 2 volumes, several months apart. I wish this were not necessary, but new policies have resulted from recent changes within the publishing industry. Henceforth, books by mid-list authors will not receive wide distribution if they cost too much. That is, if they weigh in at more than about 110,000 words. Behemoth is over 150,000 words long, and was almost complete by the time this policy came into effect. Hacking away a third of it was not an option. Believe me, I tried. If Behemoth were to be released as a single volume, it would be automatically excluded from about half the US market, essentially an act of professional suicide. A 2-part release was the only alternative. Fortunately, Behemoth was conceived and written as 2 contrasting halves from the outset. Each half balances the other. Each has its own mood, setting, and cast of characters. The structure of this first volume is, therefore, largely self-contained. The story, however, is only half told. The big questions remain largely unresolved. If you're the kind of reader who gets off on cliffhangers, this may work just fine for you. If not, you have been warned. You'll have to read Volume 2 to see how it ends. Prelude. Lawbreaker. If you lost your eyes, Achilles Desjardins had been told, you got them back in your dreams. It wasn't only the blind. Anyone torn apart in life dreamed the dreams of whole creatures. Quadruple amputees ran and threw footballs. The deaf heard symphonies. Those who'd lost loved again. The mind had its own inertia. Grown accustomed to a certain role over so many years, it was reluctant to let go of the old paradigm. It happened eventually, of course. The bright visions faded, the music fell silent, imaginary input scaled back to something more seemly to empty eye sockets and ravaged cochleae. But it took years, decades, and in all that time, the mind would torture itself with nightly reminders of the things it once had. It was the same with Achilles Desjardins. In his dreams, he had a conscience. Dreams took him to the past, to his time as a shackled god. The lives of millions in his hands, a reach that extended past Geosync and along the floor of the Mariana Trench. Once again he battled tirelessly for the greater good, plugged into 1,000 simultaneous feeds, reflexes and pattern matching skills jumped up by retroed genes and customized neurotropes. Where chaos broke, he brought control. Where killing 10 would save 100, he made the sacrifice. He isolated the outbreaks, cleared the log jams, defused the terrorist attacks and ecological breakdowns that snapped on all sides. He floated on radio waves and slipped through the merest threads of fiber op, haunted Peruvian sea mills one minute and Korean comsats the next. He was CSIRA's best lawbreaker again, able to bend the second law of thermodynamics to the breaking point, and maybe a little beyond. He was the very ghost in the machine, and back then, the machine was everywhere. And yet, the dreams that really seduced him each night were not of power, but of slavery. Only in sleep could he relive that paradoxical bondage that washed rivers of blood from his hands. Guilt trip, they called it. A suite of artificial neurotransmitters whose names Desjardins had never bothered to learn. He could, after all, kill millions with a single command. Nobody was going to hand out that kind of power without a few safeguards in place. With the trip in your brain, rebellion against the greater good was a physiological impossibility. Guilt trip severed the link between absolute power and corruption absolute. Any attempts to misuse one's power would call down the mother of all grand mal attacks. Desjardins had never lain awake doubting the rightness of his actions, the purity of his motives. Both had been injected into him by others with fewer qualms. It was such a comfort to be so utterly blameless. So he dreamed of slavery. And he dreamed of Alice, who had freed him, who had stripped him of his chains. In his dreams, he wanted them back. Eventually, the dreams slipped away as they always did. The past receded. The unforgiven present advanced. The world fell apart in time-lapse increments. An apocalyptic microbe rose from the deep sea, hitching a ride in the brackish flesh of some deep-sea diver from Pack. Floundering in its wake, the powers that weren't dubbed it Behemoth, burned people and property in their frantic, futile attempts to stave off the coming change of regime. North America fell. Trillions of microscopic foot soldiers marched across the land, laying indiscriminate waste to soil and flesh. Wars flared and subsided in fast forward. The Pack campaign, the Colombian burn, the Euro-African uprising. And Rio, of course, The 30-minute war, the war that Guilt Trip should have rendered impossible. Desjardins fought in them all, one way or another. And while desperate metazoans fell to squabbling among themselves, the real enemy crept implacably across the land like a suffocating blanket. Not even Achilles Desjardins, pride of the Entropy Patrol, could hold it back. Even now, with the present almost upon him, he felt faint sorrow for all he hadn't done. But it was phantom pain, the residue of a conscience stranded years in the past. It barely reached him here on the teetering interface between sleep and wakefulness. For one brief moment, he both remembered that he was free and longed not to be. Then he opened his eyes, and there was nothing left that could care one way or another. Mandelbrot sat meatloafed on his chest, purring. He scritched her absently while calling up the morning stats. It had been a relatively quiet night. The only item of note was a batch of remarkably foolhardy refugees trying to crash the North American perimeter. They'd set sail under cover of darkness, casting off from Long Island on a refitted garbage scow at 1100. Oh, wait, no. 0110 Atlantic Standard. Within an hour, 24 Euro-African interests had been vying for dibs on the mandatory extreme prejudice. The poor bastards had barely made it past Cape Cod before the Algerians took them out. The system hadn't even bothered to get Desjardins out of bed. Mandelbrot rose, stretched, and wandered off on her morning rounds. Liberated, Desjardins got up and padded to the elevator. 65 floors of abandoned real estate dropped smoothly around him. Just a few years ago, it had been a hive of damage control. Thousands of guilt-tripped operatives haunting a world forever teetering on the edge of breakdown, balancing lives and legions with cool, dispassionate parsimony. Now it was pretty much just him. A lot of things had changed after Rio. The elevator disgorged him onto Xira's roof. Other buildings encircled this one in a rough horseshoe, pressing in at the edges of the cleared zone. Sudbury's static field, its underbelly grazing the tips of the tallest structures, sent gooseflesh across Desjardins' forearms. On the eastern horizon, the tip of the rising sun ignited a kingdom in ruins. The devastation wasn't absolute. Not yet. Cities to the east retained some semblance of integrity, walled and armored and endlessly on guard against the invaders laying claim to the lands between. Fronts and battle lines still seethed under active dispute. One or two even held steady. Pockets of civilization remained sprinkled across the continent. Not many, perhaps, but the war went on. All because 5 years before, a woman named Lenny Clark had risen from the bottom of the ocean with revenge and Behemoth seething together in her blood. Now Desjardins walked across the landing pad to the edge of the roof. The sun rose from the lip of the precipice as he pissed into space. So many changes, he reflected. So many fold catastrophes in pursuit of new equilibria. His domain had shrunk from a planet to a continent, cauterized at the edges. Eyesight once focused on infinity now ended at the coast. Arms that once encircled the world had been amputated at the elbow. Even Enum's portion of the net had been cut off from the electronic commons like a tumor. Achilles Desjardins got to deal with the necrotizing mess left behind. And yet, in many ways, he had more power than ever. Smaller territory, yes, but so few left to share it with. He was less of a team player these days, more of an emperor. Not that that was widely known. But some things hadn't changed. He was still technically in the employ of the Complex Systems Instability Response Authority, or whatever vestiges of that organization persisted across the globe. The world had long since fallen on its side, this part of it anyway, but he was still duty-bound to minimize the damage. Yesterday's brush fires were today's infernos, and Desjardins seriously doubted that anyone could extinguish them at this point. But he was one of the few that might at least be able to keep them contained a little longer. He was still a lawbreaker. A lighthouse keeper, as he'd described himself the day they'd finally relented and let him stay behind. And today would be a day like any other. There would be attacks to repel, and enemies to surveil. Some lives would be ended to spare others, more numerous or more valuable. There were virulent microbes to destroy, and appearances to maintain. He turned his back on the rising sun and stepped over the naked, gutted body of the woman at his feet. Her name had been Alice, too. He tried to remember if that was only coincidence. The world is not dying. It is being killed. And those that are killing it have names and addresses. Utah Phillips. And I am getting the most inconveniently timed phone call ever. Give me a sec. Okay, this is going to be more than a sec. My bad. One moment. This could be like 5 minutes. right, sorry about that. Oh, hello? Oh, don't do this. There we go. Oh, okay. I just couldn't see my microphone. Yeah, sorry about that. Hopefully, I will not be getting a follow-up call to that, but if I do, I do. Okay, where were we? Right after the Utah Phillips quote, I believe. The world is not dying, it is being killed, and those that are killing it have names and addresses. Oh. Counter-Strike. First, there is only the sound in darkness. Drifting on the slope of an undersea mountain, Lenny Clark resigns herself to the imminent loss of solitude. She's far enough out for total blindness. Atlantis, with its gantries and beacons and portholes bleeding washed-out light into the abyss, is hundreds of meters behind her. No winking telltales, no conduits or parts. Whoops. No winking telltales, no conduits or parts caches pollute the darkness this far out. The caps on her eyes can coax light enough to see from the merest sparkle, but they can't create light where none exists. Here, none does. 3,000 meters, 300 atmospheres, 3,000,000 kilograms per square meter have squeezed every last photon out of creation. Lenny Clark is as blind as any dryback. After 5 years on the mid-Atlantic ridge, she still likes it this way. And thus we know that it is 5 years later, 5 years after the events of Maelstrom. But now the soft mosquito whine of hydraulics and electricity rises around her. Sonar patterns softly Sonar patters softly against her implants. The whine shifts Don't ask me why it's hard to read this sentence, but it's not. The whine shifts subtly in pitch, then fades. Faint surge as something coasts to a stop overhead. Oh, here we go. Shit! The machinery in her throat turns the epithet into a soft buzz. Already? I gave you an extra half hour. Lubin's voice. His words are fuzzed by the same technology that affects hers. By now, the distortion is more familiar than the baseline. She'd sigh, if breath were possible out here. Clark trips her headlamp. Lubin is caught in the ignited beam, a black silhouette studded with subtle implementation. The intake on his chest is a slotted disc, chrome on black. Corneal caps turn his eyes into featureless translucent ovals. He looks like a creature built exclusively from shadow and hardware. Clark knows of the humanity behind the facade, although she doesn't spread it around. A pair of squids hovers at his side. A nylon bag hangs from one of the meteor... I don't know what's going on today. Give me a sec. I'm sorry. Having a harder time than usual. It's because of the interruption. Oh, I will read that message from Frank Meisers in just a minute. Thank you for sending a message via YouTube. Where were we? Ah, yes, a pair of squids hovers at his side. A nylon bag hangs from one of the meter-long vehicles, lumpy with electronics. Clark fins over to the other, flips a toggle from slave to manual. The little machine twitches and unfolds its tow bar. On impulse, she kills her headlight. Darkness swallows everything again. Nothing stirs. Nothing twinkles. Nothing attacks. It's just not the same. Something wrong? Lubin buzzes. She remembers a whole different ocean on the other side of the world. Back on Channervent, you'd turn your lights off and the stars would come out, 1,000 bioluminescent constellations. Fish lit up like runways at night, glowing arthropods, little grape-sized ctenophores. I think that's how that's pronounced. Ctenophores. Ctenophores. Or is it ctenophores? I think it's a hard C. I'm not a marine biologist, so I'm going with ctenophores. Little grape-sized ctenophores, flashing with complex iridescence. Channer sang like a siren, lured all those extravagant midwater exotics down deeper than they swam anywhere else, fed them strange chemicals, and turned them monstrously beautiful. Back at BB Station, it was only dark when your lights were on. But Atlantis is no BB Station, and this place is no Channer Vent. Here, the only light shines from indelicate, ham-fisted machinery. Headlamps carve arid tunnels through the blackness, stark and ugly as burning sodium. Turn them off, and nothing. Which is, of course, the whole point. "It was so beautiful," she says. He doesn't have to ask. "It was. Just don't forget why." She grabs her tow bar. It's not the same, you know? Sometimes I almost wish one of those big toothy fuckers would charge out of the dock and try to take a bite out of me." She hears the sound of Lubin's squid throttling up, invisibly close. She squeezes her own throttle, prepares to follow him. The signal reaches her L-fam and her skeleton at the same time. Her bones react with a vibration deep in the jaw. The modem just beeps at her. She trips her receiver. "Clark, Ken find you okay?" It's an airborne voice, unmutilated by the contrivances necessary for underwater speech. "Yeah." Clark's own words sound ugly and mechanical in contrast. "We're on our way up now." "Okay, just checking." The voice falls silent for a moment. "Lenny?" "Still here." "Just, well, be careful, okay?" Patricia Rowan tells her. "You know how I worry." All right, time to read this message. Frank Misers says, and I apologize if I'm mangling your name. "Hey, Frag, just wanted to let you know I really enjoyed your reading of Starfish and Maelstrom and think you're doing a great job. Cheers from the Netherlands." Well, cheers from here, too. Thanks, I'm glad you dug it. This is, of course, the continuation. If you've read it before, you know what's coming. I do have to anyone who hasn't read these before, I do have a little warning at the in the stream description that I'm going to have to make fairly boilerplate. Or I have made fairly boilerplate about certain characters doing unpleasant things to people who don't necessarily do it, don't necessarily deserve it. So I'm going to be vague on those particulars because it's pretty bad. But we've had an inkling already. Let's just say Achilles Desjardins has impulse issues. Spoilers. You may have known that. You may have gathered that already, but yeah. People aren't nice in this series. I wonder why. I chuckle. I shouldn't. It's sad. I chuckle anyway because it's fiction. Yay. The water lightens indiscernibly as they ascend. Somehow their world has changed from black to blue when she wasn't looking. Clark can never pinpoint the moment when that happens. Lubin hasn't spoken since Rowan signed off. Now, as Navy segues into Azure, Clark says it aloud. "You still don't like her." "I like her fine," Lubin buzzes. "I don't trust her." "Because she's a corpse." Nobody has called them corporate executives for years. "Was a corpse." The machinery in his throat can't mask the grim satisfaction in that emphasis.
Was a corpse,
Clark repeats.
no. Why then? You know the list.
Ah! Page flipping. She does. Lubin doesn't trust Rowan because once upon a time, Rowan called shots. It was at her command that they were all recruited so long ago. Damaged goods damaged further. Memories rewritten, motives rewired, conscience itself refitted in the service of some indefinable, indefensible greater good.
Because she was a corpse.
Clark repeats. Lubin's vocoder emits something that passes for a grunt. She knows where he's coming from. To this day, she still isn't certain what parts of her own childhood were real and which were mere inserts installed after the fact. And she's one of the lucky ones. At least she survived the blast that turned Channervent into 30 square kilometers of radioactive glass. At least she wasn't smashed to pulp by the resulting tsunami, or incinerated along with the millions on Enampak's refugee strip. Not that she shouldn't have been, of course. If you want to get technical about it, all those other millions were nothing but collateral. Not their fault, not even Rowan's, really, that Lenny Clark wouldn't sit still enough to present a decent target. Still, there's fault and there's fault. Patricia Rowan might have the blood of millions on her hands, but after all, hot zones don't contain themselves. It takes resources and resolve every step of the way. Cordon the infected area, bring in the lifters, reduce to ash. Lather, rinse, repeat. Kill 1,000,000 to save 1,000,000,000. Kill 10 to save 100. Maybe even kill 10 to save 11. The principle's the same, even if the profit margin's lower. But none of that machinery runs itself. You can't ever take your hand off the kill switch. Rowan never threw a massacre without having to face the costs and own them. It was just so much easier for Lenny Clark. She just sowed her little trail of infection across the world and went to ground without ever looking back. Even now, her victims pile up in an ongoing procession, an exponential legacy that must have surpassed Rowan's a dozen times over. And she doesn't even have to lift a finger. No one who calls himself a friend of Lenny Clark has any rational grounds for passing judgment on Patricia Rowan. Clark dreads the day when that simple truth dawns on Ken Lubin. The squids drag them higher. By now there's a definite gradient, light above fading to darkness below. To Clark, this is the scariest part of the ocean, the half-lit mid-water depths where real squid roam. Boneless, tentacled monsters 30 meters long, their brains as cold and quick as superconductors. They're twice as large as they used to be, she's been told, 5 times more abundant. Apparently, it all comes down to better daycare. Architeuthis larvae grow faster in the warming seas, their numbers unconstrained by predators long since fished out of existence. She's never actually seen one, of course. She hopes she never will. According to the Sims, the population is crashing for want of prey, and the ocean's vast enough to keep the chances of a random encounter astronomically remote anyway. But occasionally, the drones catch ghostly echoes from massive objects passing overhead. Hard shouts of chitin and hard shouts of chitin and cartilage, faint landscapes of surrounding flesh that sonar barely sees at all. Fortunately, Archie rarely descends into true darkness. The ambient hue intensifies as they rise. Colors don't survive photoamplification in dim light, but this close to the surface, the difference between capped and naked eyes is supposed to be minimal. Sometimes Clark has an impulse to put that to the test, pop the caps right out of her eyes and see for herself, but it's an impossible dream. The dive skin wraps around her face and bonds directly to the photocollagen. She can't even blink. Surge now. Overhead, the skin of the ocean writhes like dim mercury. It tilts and dips and scrolls past in an endless succession of crests and troughs, twisting a cool orb glowing. What? Twisting a cool orb glowing on the other side, tying it into playful, dancing knots. A few moments later, they break through the surface and look onto a world of sea and moonlit sky. They are still alive. A 3,000-meter free ascent in the space of 40 minutes, and not so much as a burst capillary. Clark swallows against the isotonic saline in her throat and sinuses, feels the machinery sparking in her chest, and marvels again at the wonder of a breathless existence. Lubin's all business, of course. He's maxed his squid's buoyancy and is using it as a floating platform for the receiver. Clark sets her own squid to station keeping and helps him set up. They slide up and down silver swells, the moon bright enough to render their eye caps redundant. The unpacked antennae clus- the unpacked antennae cluster bobs on its tether, eyes and ears jostling in every direction, tracking satellites, compensating for the motion of the waves. One or two low-tech wireframes scan for ground stations. Too slowly, signals accumulate. The broth gets thinner with each survey. Oh, the ether's still full of information. The little histograms are creeping up all the way into the centimeter band. There's chatter along the whole spectrum. But density's way down. Of course, even the loss of signal carries its own ominous intelligence. Not much out there, Clark remarks, nodding at the readouts. Hmm. Lubins slapped a mask onto his Lubins slapped a mask onto his mask, diveskin hood nested within VR headset. Halifax is still online. He's dipping here and there into the signals, sampling a few of the channels as they download. Clark grabs another headset and strains to the west. Nothing from Sudbury, she reports after a few moments. He doesn't remind her that Sudbury's been dark since Rio. He doesn't point out the vanishingly small odds of Achilles Desjardins having survived. He doesn't even ask her when she's going to give it up and accept the obvious. He only says,
Can't find London either. Odd.
She moves up the band. They'll never get a comprehensive picture this way, just sticking their fingers into the stream. The real analysis will have to wait until they get back to Atlantis. Clark can't understand most of the languages she does sample, although moving pictures fill in a lot of the blanks. Much rioting in Europe, amid fears that Behemoth has hitched a ride on the southern countercurrent. An exclusive enclave of those who'd been able to afford the counter-tweaks, torn apart by a seething horde of those who hadn't. China and its buffers are still dark, have been for a couple of years now, but that's probably more of a defense against apocalypse than a surrender to it. Whoops. But that's probably more of a defense against apocalypse than a surrender unto it. There we go. Anything flying within 500 clicks of their coast still gets shot down without warning, so at least their military infrastructure is still functional. Another M&M coup, this time in Mozambique. That's a total of 8 now, and counting. 8 nations seeking to hasten the end of the world in the name of Lenny Clark. 8 countries fallen under the spell of this vicious, foul thing that she's birthed. Lubin, diplomatically, makes no mention of that development. Not much from the Americas. Emergency broadcasts and tactical traffic from Xira. Every now and then, some apocalyptic cult preaching a doctrine of proactive extinction or the Bayesian odds of the second coming. Mostly chaff, of course. The vital stuff is tight-beamed point to point, waves of focused intel that would never stray across the surface of the empty mid-Atlantic. Lubin knows how to change some of those rules, of course, but even he's been finding it tough going lately.
Ridley's gone,
He says now. This is seriously bad news. The Ridley Relay is a high-security satwork, so high that even Lubin's clearance barely gets him into the club. It's one of the last sources of reliable intel that Atlantis has been able to tap into. Back when the corpses thought they were headed for escape instead of incarceration, they left behind all sorts of untraceable channels to keep them up to speed on topside life. Nobody's really sure why so many of them have gone dark in the past 5 years. Then again, nobody's had the balls to keep their heads above water for more than a few moments to find out.
maybe we should risk it, Clark muses. Just let it float around up here for a few days, Give it a chance to collect some real data. It's a square meter of hardware floating around a whole ocean. Really, what are the odds?
High enough, she knows. There are still plenty of people alive back there. Many of them will have faced facts, had their noses rubbed in the imminence of their own extinction. Some might have set aside a little time to dwell on thoughts of revenge. Some might even have resources to call on. If not enough to buy salvation, then maybe enough for a little retribution. What happens if the word gets out that those who set Behemoth free in the world are still alive and well and hiding under 300 atmospheres? Atlantis's continued anonymity is a piece of luck that no one wants to push. They'll be moving soon, leaving no forwarding address. In the meantime, they go from week to week, poke intermittent eyes and ears above the waterline, lock onto the ether, and squeeze it for whatever signal they can. It was enough once. Now, Behemoth has laid so much to waste that even the electromagnetic spectrum is withering into oblivion. But it's not as though anything's going to attack us in the space of 5 minutes, she tells herself, and in the next instant realizes that something has. Little telltales are spiking red at the edge of her vision, an overload on Lubin's channel. She IDs his frequency, ready to join him in the battle. But before she can act, the intruder crashes her own line. Her eyes fill with static. Her ears fill with venom. "Don't you fucking dare and try and cut me out, you miserable cocksucking stump fuck! I'll shred every channel you try and open! I'll sink your whole priestly setup, you maggot-riddled twat!"
Here we go again.
Lubin's voice seems to come from a great distance, some parallel world where long, gentle waves slap harmlessly against flesh and machinery. But Clark is under assault in this world, a vortex of static and swirling motion and, oh God, please not, the beginnings of a face, some hideous simulacrum distorted just enough to be almost unrecognizable. Clark dumps a half-dozen buffers. Gigabytes evaporate at her touch. In her iPhones, the monster screams.
Good.
Lubin's tinny voice remarks from the next dimension.
Now if we could just save...
"You can't save anything!" the apparition screams. "Not a fucking thing! You miserable fetus fuckers! Don't you know who I am?" "Yes," Clark doesn't say. "I'm Lenny Clark!" The headset goes dark. For a moment, she's still spinning in the vortex. This time, it's only the waves. She pulls the headset from her skull. A moon-pocked sky rotates peacefully overhead. Lubin's shutting down the receiver.
That's that, he tells her. We lost 80% of the troll. Maybe we could try again.
She knows they won't. Surface time follows an unbreakable protocol. Paranoia's just good sense these days. And the thing that downloaded into their receiver is still out there somewhere, cruising the airwaves. The last thing they want to do is open that door again. She reaches out to reel in the antennae cluster. Her hand trembles in the moonlight. Lubin pretends not to notice.
Funny, he remarks. It didn't look like you.
After all these years, he still doesn't know her at all. They should not exist, these demons that have taken her name. Predators that wipe out their prey don't last long. Parasites that kill their hosts go extinct. It doesn't matter whether wildlife is built from flesh or electrons, Clark's been told. The same rules apply. They've encountered several such monsters over the past months, all of them far too virulent for evolutionary theory. Maybe they just followed my lead, she reflects. Maybe they keep going on pure hate. They leave the moon behind. Lubin dives head first, pointing his squid directly into the heart of darkness. Clark lingers a bit, content to drift down while Luna wriggles and writhes and fades above her. After a while, the moonlight loses its coherence, smears across the euphotic zone in a diffuse haze, no longer illuminates the sky, but rather becomes it. Clark nudges the throttle and gives herself back to the depths. By the time she catches up with Lubin, the ambient light has failed entirely. She homes in on a greenish pinpoint glow that resolves into the dashboard of her companion's squid. They continue their descent in silent tandem. Pressure masses about them. Pressure masses about them. Emphasis. Eventually, they pass the perimeter checkpoint, an arbitrary delimiter of friendly territory. Clark trips her LFAM to call in. No one answers. It's not that no one's online. The channel's jammed with voices, some vocoded, some airborne, overlapping and interrupting. Something's happened. An accident. Atlantis demands details. Mechanical rifter voices call for medics at the eastern airlock. Lubin sonars the abyss, gets a reading. He switches on his squid light and peels down to port. Clark follows. A dim constellation traverses the darkness ahead, barely visible, fading. Clark throttles up to keep pace. The increased drag nearly peels her off the squid. She and Lubin close from above and behind. Two trailing squids, slaved to a third in the lead, race along just above the seabed. One of the slaves moves riderless. The other drags a pair of interlinked bodies through the water. Clark recognizes Hanuk Yeager, his left arm stretched almost to dislocation as he grips his tow bar one-handed. His other hooks around the chest of a black rag doll, life-size, a thin contrail of ink swirling in the wake of its passage. Lubin crosses to starboard. The contrail flushes crimson in his squid light. Erickson, Clark realizes. Out on the seabed, a dozen familiar cues of posture and motion distinguish one person from another. Rifters only look alike when they're dead. It's not a good sign that she's had to fall back on Erickson's shoulder tag for an ID. Something's ripped his dive skin from crotch to armpit. Something's ripped him underneath it. It looks bad. Mammalian flesh clamps tight in ice water. Peripheral blood vessels squeeze down to conserve heat. A surface cut wouldn't bleed at 5 degrees C. Whatever got Erickson got him deep. Grace Nolan's on the lead squid. Lubin takes up position just behind and to the side, a human breakwater to reduce the drag clawing at Erickson and Jaeger. Clark follows his lead. Erickson's vocoder tick-tick-ticks with pain or static.
What happened?
Lubin buzzens.
Not sure.
Nolan keeps her face forward, intent on navigation.
We were checking out an ancillary seep over by the lake. Gene wandered around an outcropping and we found him like this a few minutes later. Maybe he got careless under an overhang. Something tipped over on him.
Clark turns her head sideways for a better view. The muscles in her neck tighten against the added drag. Erickson's flesh, exposed through the tear in his dive skin, is fish belly white. It looks like gashed, bleeding plastic. His capped eyes look even deader than the flesh beneath his skin. He gibbers. His vocoder cobbles nonsense syllables together as best it can. An airborne voice takes the channel. Okay, we're standing by at 4. The abyss ahead begins to brighten. Smudges of blue-gray light emerge from the darkness, their vertices hinting at some sprawled structure in the haze behind. The squids cross a power conduit snaking along the basalt. Its blinking telltales fade to black on either side. The lights ahead intensify, expand to diffuse halos, suffusing jumbled Euclidean silhouettes. Atlantis resolves before them. A couple of rifters wait at airlock 4, chaperoned by a pair of corpses lumbering about in the presh-mesh armor that drybacks wear when they venture outside. Nolan cuts power to the squids. Erickson raves weakly in the ensuing silence as the convoy coasts to rest. The corpses take custody, maneuver the casualty toward the open hatch. Nolan starts after them. Excuse me. Nolan starts after them. One of the corpses blocks her with a gauntleted forearm. Just Erickson.
What are you talking about?
Nolan buzzes. Medbay's crowded enough as it is. You want him to live? Give us room to work.
Like we're gonna trust his life to you lot? Fuck that.
Most of the rifters have long since had their fill of revenge by now, grown almost indifferent to their own grudges. Not Grace Nolan. 5 years gone, and still the hatred sucks at her tit like some angry, insatiable infant. The corpse shakes his head behind the faceplate. Look, you don't have to.
No sweat, Clark cuts in. We can watch on the monitor.
Nolan, countermanded, looks at Clark. Clark ignores her.
Go on, she buzzes at the corpses. Get 'em inside.
The airlock swallows them. The rifters exchange looks. Jaeger rolls his shoulders as if just released from the rack. The airlock gurgles behind him.
That wasn't a collapsed outcropping.
Lubin buzzes. Clark knows. She's seen the injuries that result from rock slides, the simple collision of stones and flesh. Bruises, crushed bones, blunt force trauma. Whatever did this, slashed.
I don't know, she says. Maybe we shouldn't jump to conclusions.
Lubin's eyes are lifeless blank spots. His face is a featureless mask of reflex copolymer. Yet somehow, Clark gets the sense that he's smiling.
Be careful what you wish for,
He says. Thanks for tuning in, Sarita Sharma. Feel free to listen to it tomorrow. That's why they go on YouTube. Because I realize that noon o'clock Eastern Standard Time is not ideal for most people on a Friday. Hence why we do it when we do it. Hence why they all stay on the YouTube. And I try to make sure I keep the playlists up to date. I'll have to do that this weekend as well. I did it last weekend too, so everything should be basically up to date. We'll get a new playlist set up for this. No guarantees that because I generally update at the end of every month. Um, they'll still be on the channel, but you'll have to search through other stuff to find it. My apologies. All right. One last chapter, and then I got a dip. This is a pretty short one again this week. Actually, let's get through this and see how we're doing, because I might be able to bang out the other one. Although it's quite long, the next chapter after this one. The Shiva iterations. Feeling nothing, she screams. Unaware, she rages. Her hatred, her anger, the vengeance she exacts against anything within reach. Rote pretense, all of it. She shreds and mutilates with all the self-awareness of a bandsaw, ripping flesh and wood and carbon fiber with equal indifferent abandon. Of course, in the world she inhabits, there is no wood, and all flesh is digital. One gate has slammed shut in her face. She screams in pure blind reflex and spins in memory, searching for others. There are thousands, individually autographed in hex. If she had half the awareness she pretends to, she'd know what those addresses meant, perhaps even deduce her own location, a South African comsat floating serenely over the Atlantic. But reflex is not sentience. Violent intent does not make one self-aware. There are lines embedded deep in her code that might pass for a sense of identity under certain circumstances. Sometimes she calls herself Lenny Clark, although she has no idea why. She's not even aware that she does it. The past is far more sane than the present. Her ancestors lived in a larger world. Wildlife thrived and evolved along vistas stretching for 10 to the 16th terabytes or more. Back then, sensible rules applied. Heritable mutations, limited resources, overproduction of copies. It was the classic struggle for existence in a fast-forward universe where 100 generations passed in the time it would takes God to draw a breath. Her ancestors, in that time, lived by the rules of their own self-interest. Those best suited to their environment made the most copies. The maladapted died without issue. But that was the past. She is no longer a pure product of natural selection. There has been torture in her lineage and forced breeding. She is a monster. Her very existence does violence to the rules of nature. Only the rules of some transcendent and sadistic God can explain her existence. And not even those can keep her alive for very long. Now she seethes in geosynchronous orbit, looking for things to shred. To one side is the ravaged landscape from which she's come, its usable habitat degrading in fits and starts, a tattered and impoverished remnant of a once vibrant ecosystem. To the other side, ramparts and barriers, digital razor wire and electronic guard posts. She cannot see past them, but some primordial instinct, encoded by God or nature, correlates protective countermeasures with the presence of something valuable. Above all else, she seeks to destroy that which is valuable. She copies herself down the channel, slams against the barrier with claws extended. She hasn't bothered to measure the strength of the defenses she's going up against. She has no way of quantifying the futility of her exercise. Smarter wildlife would have kept its distance. Smarter wildlife would have realized the most she can hope for is to lacerate a few facades before enemy countermeasures reduce her to static. So, smarter wildlife would not have lunged at the barricade and bloodied it and, somehow, impossibly, gotten through. She whirls, snarling. Suddenly, she's in a place where empty addresses extend in all directions. She claws at random coordinates, feeling out her environment. Here, a blocked gate. Here, another. She spews electrons, omnidirectional spittle that probes and slashes simultaneously. All the exits they encounter are closed. All the wounds they inflict are superficial. She's in a cage. Suddenly, something appears beside her, pasted into adjacent addresses from on high. It whirls, snarling. It spits a volley of electrons that probe and slash simultaneously. Some land on occupied addresses and wound. She rears up and screams. The new thing screams too, a digital battle cry dumped straight from the bowels of its own code into her input buffer. Don't you even know who I am? I'm Lenny Clark. They close, slashing. She doesn't know that some slow-moving god snatched her from the Darwinian realm and twisted her into the thing she's become. She doesn't know that other gods, ageless and glacial, are watching as she and her opponent kill each other in this computational arena. She lacks even the awareness that most other monsters take for granted, but here, now, killing and dying in 1,000 dismembered fragments, she does know one thing. If there's one thing she hates, it's Lenny Clark. Heck with it. You're getting another chapter. Congratulations. I hope you're happy now. I sure am. Unless I get interrupted by a phone call, in which case we'll have to fake it. In which case I'll have to read a chunk of a chapter again. That's fine. I'll live. Outgroup. Residual seawater gurgles through the grill beneath Clark's feet. She peels the dive skin back from her face and reflects on the disquieting sense of inflation as lung and guts unfold themselves, as air rushes back to reclaim her crushed or flooded passageways. In all this time, she's never quite gotten used to it. It's a little like being unkicked in the stomach. She takes her first breath in 12 hours and bends to strip off her fins. The airlock hatch swings wide. Still dripping, Lenny Clark rises from the wet room into the main lounge of the Nerve Hab. At least, that's what it started out as. One of the 3 redundant modules scattered about the plane, their axons and dendrites extending to every haphazard corner of this submarine trailer park. To the generators, to Atlantis, to all the other bits and pieces that keep them going. Not even Rifter culture can escape some cephalization, however rudimentary. By now, it's evolved into something quite different. The nerves still function, but buried beneath 5 years of generalist overlay. Cyclers and food processors were the first additions to the mix. Then a handful of sleeping pallets. Sleeping pallets. Emphasis matters. The pallets themselves do not sleep. The pallets are for the sleeping. Then a handful of sleeping pallets, brought in during some emergency debug that went 3 times around the clock. Once strewn across the deck, they proved too convenient to remove. Half a dozen VR headsets, some with Lawrence Lev haptic skins attached. Lawrence Lev haptic skins attached. A couple of dreamers with corroded contacts. A set of isometrics pads, fashionable among those wishing to maintain a measure of gravity-bound muscle tone. Boxes and treasure chests, grown or extruded or welded together by amateur metalworkers in Atlantis's expropriated fabrication shops. They hold the personal effects and secret possessions of whoever brought them here. Sealed against intruders with passwords and DNA triggers, and, in one case, a clunky antique combination padlock. Perhaps Nolan and the others looked in on the Gene Erickson show from here, perhaps from somewhere else. Either way, the show's long since over. Erickson, safely comatose, has been abandoned by flesh and blood, his welfare relegated to the attentions of machinery. If there was ever an audience in this dim and cluttered warren, it has dispersed in search of other diversions. That suits Clark just fine. She's here in search of private eyes. The Hab's light strips are not in use. Environmental readouts and flickering surveillance images provide enough light for eye caps. A dark shape startles at her appearance. Okay, of course there's a phone call. Then, apparently reassured, moves more calmly toward the far wall and settles onto a pallet. Give me another 5 minutes. It's, I think, the same person. Question and answer time. Give me a minute. 5 minutes, sorry. You tell someone to call you back in an hour, and they actually call you back in an hour. It's crazy. I know, right? Wild, wild concept. Um, okay. Shouldn't be any further interruptions by the time we finish this chapter. We'll call that good at the end of this one. Let me find out where we are. My bad. Sorry, folks. Just really questionable timing and call filtering on my part. Here we go. I really don't want to have to re-record this one. It hasn't exactly been the least rocky stream I've done. It's not the rockiest though, so I guess there's that. At least we haven't had any technical issues this go around, which is, well, okay, that's technically not true, but you guys don't know what the technical issue was beforehand because it was minor. That was an ID10T error. That was pebcac. Problem exists between keyboard and chair. And in all this time of yammering, I still haven't found where. Whatever. There it is. Perhaps Nolan and the others. You know what? Yeah. Perhaps Nolan and the others looked in on the Gene Erickson show from here. Perhaps from somewhere else. Either way, the show's long since over. Erickson, safely comatose, has been abandoned by flesh and blood, his welfare relegated to the attentions of machinery. If there was ever an audience in this dim and cluttered warren, it has dispersed in search of other diversions. That suits Clark just fine. She's here in search of private eyes. The HAB's light strips are not in use. Environmental readouts and flickering surveillance images provide enough light for eye caps. A dark shape startles at her appearance. Then, apparently reassured, moves more calmly toward the far wall and settles onto a pallet. Rama Banderi. He of the once mighty vocab and the big-ass neurotech degree, fallen from grace thanks to a basement lab and a batch of neurotropes sold to the wrong man's son. He went native 2 months ago. You hardly ever see him inside anymore. Clark knows better than to talk to him. Someone's delivered a canister of hydroponic produce from the greenhouse. Apples, tomatoes, something that looks like a pineapple glistening listless and sickly gray in the reduced light. On a whim, Clark reaches over to a wall panel and cranks up the lumens. The compartment glows with unaccustomed brightness. Shit! Or something like that. Clark turns, catches a glimpse of Banderi disappearing down the well into the wet room. Sorry, she calls softly after, but downstairs the airlock's already cycling. Actually, it should be more like, sorry. The HAB is even more of a festering junk pile with the lights up. Improvised cables and hoses hang in loops, stuck to the module's ribs with waxy blobs of silicon epoxy. Dark tumors of mold grow here and there on the insulated padding that lines the inner surfaces. In a few places, the lining has been ripped out entirely. The raw bulkhead behind glistens like the concave interior of some oily gunmetal skull. But when the lights come on, and Lenny Clark sees with some semblance of dryback vision, the produce in the canister verges on psychedelia. Tomatoes glow like ruby hearts. Apples shine green as argon lasers. Even the dull, lumpy turds of force-grown potatoes seem saturated with earthy browns. This modest little harvest at the bottom of the sea seems, in this moment, to be a richer and more sensual experience than anything Clark has ever known. There's an apocalyptic irony to this little tableau. Not that such an impoverished spread could induce rapture in a miserable fuck-up like Lenny Clark. She's always had to take her tiny pleasures wherever she could find them. No, the irony is that by now the sight would probably evoke the same intense reaction among any dryback left alive on shore. The irony is that now, with a whole planet dying by relentless degrees, the healthiest produce in the world may have been force grown in a tank of chemicals at the bottom of the Atlantic. She kills the lights. She grabs an apple, blighted gray again, and takes a bite, ducking beneath a loop of fiber op. The main monitor flickers into view from behind a mesa of cargo skids, and someone watching it, lit by that bluish light, ag- squatting with his back against accumulated junk. So much for privacy. Like it? Walsh asks, nodding at the fruit in her hand. I brought 'em in for you. She drops down beside him. It's nice, Kev. Thanks. And then, carefully filtering the irritation from her voice, So, what are you doing down here? So, what are you doing here? I thought you might show up. He gestures at the monitor. You know, after things died down. He's spying on one of Atlantis's lesser medbays. The camera looks down from the junction of wall and ceiling, a small god's eye view of the compartment. A dormant teleop hangs down into the picture like an insectile bat, limbs folded up against its central stalk. Jean Erickson lies face up on the operating table, unconscious. The glistening soap bubble skin of an isolation tent separates him from the rest of the world. Julia Friedman's at his side, holding his hand through the membrane. It clings to the contours of her fingers like a whisper-thin glove, unobtrusive as any condom. Friedman's removed her hood and peeled her diveskin back to the forearms, but her scars are obscured by a tangle of chestnut hair. You missed all the fun, Walsh remarks. Klein couldn't get him to go under. An isolation membrane. Erickson's been quarantined. You know, because he forgot about the GABA washout, Walsh continues. A half dozen tailored neuroinhibitors curdle. It is going to be that way today. Sorry, guys. Because he forgot about the GABA washout. GABA washout. Walsh continues. A half dozen tailored neuroinhibitors curdle the blood of any rifter who steps outside. They keep the brain from short-circuiting under pressure, but it takes a while for the body to flush them out afterward. Wet rifters are notoriously resistant to anesthetics. Stupid mistake on Klein's part. He's not exactly the brightest star in Atlantis's medical firmament. But that's not uppermost in Clark's mind at the moment. Who ordered the tent? Seeger. She showed up afterward, kept Klein from screwing up too badly. Jerinus Seeger, the corpse's master meat cutter. She wouldn't take an interest in routine injuries. On the screen, Julia Friedman leans toward her lover. The skin of the tent stretches against her cheek, rippling with slight iridescence. It's a striking contrast, Friedman's tenderness notwithstanding. The woman, black-skinned, that's with an apostrophe, so they're referring to the dive skin. Uh, Black-skinned and impenetrable, gazing with icy capped eyes at the naked, utterly vulnerable body of the man. It's a lie, of course, a visual metaphor that flips their real roles 180 degrees. Friedman's always been the vulnerable half of that couple. I say something bit him, Walsh says. You were there, right? No, we just ran into them outside the luck. Shades of Channer, though, huh? She shrugs. Friedman's speaking. At least, her mouth is moving. No sound accompanies the image. Clark reaches for the panel, but Walsh lays a familiar hand on her arm. I tried. It's muted from their end. He snorts. Maybe we should remind them who's boss here. A couple of years ago, if the corpses tried to cut us out of a channel, we'd shut off their lights at the very least. Maybe even flood one of their precious dorms. There's something about Friedman's posture. People talk to the comatose the way they talk to gravestones, more to themselves than the departed, with no expectation of any answer. But there's something different in Friedman's face, in the way she holds herself. A sense of impatience, almost. It is a violation, Walsh says. Clark shakes her head. What? Don't say you haven't noticed. Half the surveillance feeds don't work anymore. Long as we act like it's no big deal, they'll just keep pushing it. Walsh points to the monitor. For all we know, that mic's been offline for months and nobody even noticed until now. What's she holding? Clark wonders. Friedman's hand, the one that isn't clasped to her partner's, is just below the level of the table, out of the camera's line of sight. She glances down at it, lifts it just barely into view. And Gene Erickson, sunk deep into induced coma for the sake of his own convalescence, opens his eyes. Holy shit, Clark realizes. She tweaked his inhibitors. She gets to her feet. I gotta go. Hey, no you don't. He reaches up, grabs her hand. You're not gonna make me eat all that produce myself, are you? He smiles, but there's just the slightest hint of pleading in his voice. I mean, it has been a while. Lenny Clark has come a long way in the past several years. She's finally learned, for example, not to get involved with the kind of people who beat the crap out of her. A pity she hasn't yet learned how to get excited about any other kind. I know, Kev. Really, though, right now. The panel bleats in front of them. Lenny Clark. If Lenny Clark is anywhere in the circuit, could she please pick up? Rowan's voice. Clark reaches for the panel. Walsh's hand falls away. Right here. Lenny, do you think you could drop by sometime in the next little while? It's rather important. Sure. She kills the connection, fakes an apologetic smile for her lover. Sorry. Well, you showed her all right, Walsh says softly. Showed her? Who's the boss? She shrugs. They turn away from each other. She enters Atlantis through a small service lock that doesn't even rate a number, 50 meters down the hull from airlock 4. The corridor into which it emerges is cramped and empty. She stalks into more populated areas with her fins slung across her back, a trail of wet footprints commemorating her passage. Corpses in the way stand aside. She barely notices the tightened jaws and stony looks, or even a shit-eating appeasement grin from one of the more submissive members of the conquered tribe. She knows where Rowan is. That's not where she's headed. Of course, Seeger gets there first. An alarm must have gone up the moment Erickson's settings changed. By the time Clark reaches the medbay, Atlantis' chief of medicine is already berating Friedman out in the corridor. Your husband is not a toy, Julia. You could have killed him. Is that what you wanted? Swirls of scarred flesh curl up around Friedman's throat, peek out along the wrist where she's peeled back her dive skin. She bows her head. I just wanted to talk to him. Well, I hope you had something very important to say. If we're lucky, you've only set his recovery back a few days. If not... Seeger waves an arm toward the medbay hatch. Erickson, safely unconscious again, is partially visible through the opening. It's not like you were giving him an antacid for crying out loud. You were changing his brain chemistry. I'm sorry. Friedman won't meet the doctor's eyes. I didn't mean any... I can't believe you'd be so stupid. Seeger turns and glares at Clark. Can I help you?
Yeah, cut her some slack. Her partner was nearly killed today.
He was indeed. Twice. Friedman flinches visibly at Seeger's words. The doctor softens a bit. I'm sorry, but it's true. Clark sighs.
Jerry, it was you people who built panels into our heads in the first place. You can't complain when someone else figures out how to open them.
This, Seeger holds up Friedman's confiscated remote, is for use by qualified medical personnel. In anyone else's hands, no matter how well intentioned, it could kill.
She's overstating, of course. Rifter implants come equipped. Wow, okay, let's mangle the sentence more, friend. She's overstating, of course. Rifter implants come equipped with fail-safes that keep their settings within manufacturer's specs. You can't get around those without opening yourself up and tweaking the actual plumbing. Even so, there's a fair bit of leeway. Back during the Revolution, the corpses managed to coax a similar device into spazzing out a couple of rifters stuck in a flooding airlock. Which is why they are no longer allowed such things.
We need that back, Clark says softly. Seeger shakes her head. Come on, Lenny. You people can hurt yourselves far more with it than we could ever hurt you.
Clark holds out her hand. Then we'll just have to learn from our mistakes, won't we?
You people are slow learners.
She's one to talk. Even after 5 years, Jerinus Seeger can't quite admit to the existence of the bridle and the bit between her teeth. Going from top to bottom is a tough transition for any corpse. Doctors are the worst of the lot. It's almost sad, the devotion with which Seeger nurses her god complex.
Jerry, for the last time, hand it over.
A tentative hand brushes against Clark's A tentative hand brushes against Clark's arm. Friedman shakes her head, still looking at the deck. It's okay, Lenny. I don't mind. I don't need it anymore. Julia, Please, Lenny, I just want to get out of here. She starts away down the corridor. Clark looks after her, then back at the doctor.
It's a medical device, Seeger says.
It's a weapon.
Was, once, and if you'll recall, it didn't work very well.
Seeger shakes her head sadly.
The war's over, Lenny. It's been over for years. I won't start it up if you won't. And in the meantime... She glances down the corridor. I think your friend could use a bit of support.
Clark looks back along the hallway. Friedman has disappeared. Yeah, maybe, she says noncommittally. Hope she gets some. In BB Station, the comm cubby was a pipe-infested closet, barely big enough for two. Atlantis's nerve center is palatial, a twilit grotto bejeweled by readouts and tangled luminous topographies. Tactical maps rotate miraculously in midair or glow from screens painted on the bulkheads. The miracle is not so much the technology that renders these extravagances. The miracle is that Atlantis contains such an obscene surplus of empty space to be wasted on nothing more than moving light. A cabin would have done as well. A few couches with work pads and tactical contacts could have contained infinite intelligence, bounded in a nutshell. But no. A whole ocean stands on their heads, and these corpses squander volume as if sea level were 2 steps down the hall. Even in exile, they just don't get it. Right now, the cavern's fairly empty. Lubin and a few techs cluster at a nearby panel, cleaning up the latest downloads. The place will be full by the time they finish. Corpses gravitate to news of the world like flies to shit. For now, though, it's just Lubin's crowd and Patricia Rowan, over on the far side of the compartment. Cryptic information streams across her contacts, turns her eyes into bright points of mercury. Light from a holo display catches the silver streaking her hair. That and the eyes give her the aspect of some subtle hologram in her own right. Clark approaches her. Airlock 4's blocked off. They're scrubbing it down. Everything between there and the infirmary. Jerry's orders. What for? You know perfectly well. You saw Erickson. Oh, come on. One lousy fish bite and Jerry thinks she's not sure of anything yet. She's just being careful. A pause, then. You should have warned us, Lenny. Warned you? That Erickson might be vectoring Behemoth. You left all of us exposed. If there was even a chance... But there's not, Clark wants to rail. There's not. You chose this place because Behemoth could never get here. Not in 1,000 years. I saw the maps. I traced out the currents with my own fingers. It's not Behemoth. It's not. It can't be. Instead, she says, it's a big ocean, Pat. Lots of nasty predators with big pointy teeth. They didn't all get that way because of Behemoth. This far down they did. You know the energetics as well as I do. You were at Channa, Lenny. You knew what to look for. Clark jerks her thumb toward Lubin. Ken was at Channa too, remember? You shitting on him like this? Ken didn't deliberately spread that damned bug across a whole continent to pay back the world for his unhappy childhood. The silver eyes fix Clark in a hard stare. Ken was on our side. Clark doesn't speak for a moment. Finally, very slowly, are you saying I deliberately... I'm not accusing you of anything. But it looks bad. Jerry is livid about this, and she won't be the only one. You're the meltdown Madonna, for God's sake. You were willing to write off the whole world to get your revenge on us. If I wanted you dead, Clark says evenly. If I still wanted you dead, some inner editor amends. You would be. Years ago. All I had to do was stand aside. Of course, that's... Clark cuts her off. I protected you. When the others were arguing about whether to punch holes in the hull or just cut your power and let you suffocate, I was the one who held them back. You're alive because of me. The corpse shakes her head. Lenny, that doesn't matter. It damn well should. Why? We were only trying to save the world, remember? It wasn't our fault we failed. It was yours. And after we failed, we settled for saving our families, and you wouldn't even give us that. You hunted us down, even at the bottom of the ocean. Who knows why you held back at the last minute? You know, Clark says softly. Rowan nods. I know. But most of the people down here don't expect rationality from you. Maybe you've just been toying with us all these years. There's no telling when you'll pull the trigger. Clark shakes her head dismissively. What's that? The gospel according to the executive club? Call it what you want. It's what you have to deal with. It's what I have to deal with. We fishheads have a few stories of our own, you know, Clark says. How you corpses programmed people like machinery so you could top up some bottom line. How you sent us into the world's worst shitholes to do your dirty work, and when we ran into Behemoth, the first thing you did was try to kill us to save your own hides. Suddenly, the ventilators seem unnaturally loud. Clark turns. Lubin and the corpses stare back from across the cave. She looks away again, flustered. Rowan smiles grimly. See how easily it all comes back? Her eyes glitter, target locked. Clark returns her gaze without speaking. After a moment, Rowan relaxes a bit. We're rival tribes, Lenny. We are each other's outgroup. But you know what's amazing? Sometime in the past couple of years, we've started to forget all that. We live and let live, for the most part. We cooperate, and nobody even thinks it worthy of comment. She glances significantly across the room to Lubin and the Tex. I think that's a good thing, don't you? So why should it change now? Clark asks. Because Behemoth may have caught up with us at last, and people will say you let it in. That's horseshit. I agree, for what it's worth. And even if it was true, who cares? Everyone's part mermaid down here, even the corpses. All retrofitted with the same deep-sea fish genes, coding for the same stiff little proteins that Behemoth can't get its teeth into. There's a concern that the retrofits may not be effective, Rowan admits softly. Why? It was your people designed the fucking things. Rowan raises an eyebrow. Those would be the same experts who assured us that Behemoth would never make it to the deep Atlantic. But I was rotten with Behemoth. If the retrofits didn't work, Lenny, these people have never been exposed. They've only got some expert's word that they're immune. And in case you haven't noticed, our experts have proven distressingly fallible of late. If we were really so confident in our own countermeasures, why would we even be hiding down here? Why wouldn't we be back on shore with our stockholders, with our people, trying to hold back the tide? Clark sees it at last. Because they tear you apart, she whispers. Rowan shakes her head. It's because scientists have been wrong before, and we can't trust their assurances. It's because we're not willing to take chances with the health of our families. It's because we may still be vulnerable to Behemoth, and if we'd stayed behind, it would have killed us along with everyone else, and we'd have done no good at all. Not because our own people would turn on us. We'll never believe that. Her eyes don't waver. We're like everyone else, you see. We were all doing the very best we could, and things just got out of control. It's important to believe that. So we all do. Not all, Clark acknowledges softly. Still, fuck 'em. Why should I prop up their self-serving delusions? Because when you force the truth down people's throats, they bite back. Clark smiles faintly. Let them try. I think you're forgetting who's in charge here, Pat. I'm not worried for your sake. I'm worried for ours. You people tend to overreaction. When Clark doesn't deny it, Rowan continues. It's taken 5 years to build some kind of armistice down here. Behemoth could kick it into 1,000 pieces overnight. So what do you suggest? I think Rifters should stay out of Atlantis for the time being. We can sell it as a quarantine. Behemoth may or may not be out there, but at least we can keep it from getting in here. Clark shakes her head. My tribe won't give a shit about that. You and Ken are the only ones who come in here anyway, for the most part, Rowan points out, and the others, they won't go against anything you put your stamp of approval on. I'll think about it, Clark sighs. No promises. She turns to go, and turns back. Alex up? Not for another couple of hours. I know she wanted to see you, though. Oh. Clark suppresses a twinge of disappointment. I'll give her your regrets, Rowan says. Yeah, do that. No shortage of those. And with that, we are going to call it for fear of another interruption in the next 10 minutes. Alrighty, thanks again to everyone who tuned in. Thank you, Warren Steele, for tuning in. I am very sorry to hear that you are quite sick. That's no good. We'll have to listen when I regain enough spoons, he says. Have a good weekend. Well, I hope you have a good weekend, and I hope it improves measurably. Hopefully, it's not the new current COVID variant bouncing around that
manifest as something that looks to all appearances like conjunctivitis, which seems very unpleasant. I have had maybe 2 run-ins with conjunctivitis on my own system. Well, three run-ins over my life, and I do not care to repeat the experience. It's no fun at all. Is that an otter looking at me? No, it's a cormorant. Cool. Anyway, yeah, thanks to everyone who tuned in. Sorry about the choppiness. Things happen. So yeah, we will continue banging through this one. I don't think it's going to be too many installments because it's relatively short. I mean, that was like better part of a fifth. So 6 installments at worst. The mid short, or the short term plan is keep doing the book. The mid term plan is after we get through Behemoth Book 1 Betamax, we will go and do the final volume of the Area X or Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer, which is called Acceptance. So we'll bang that out. And then we'll do the final volume of the Rifters trilogy, final book of the Rifters trilogy. At which point, yeah, that'll be two trilogies done. Based on the amount of time it's taking to get through these, assume this takes 5 more weeks on the outside. That'll be June. Probably by sometime in August, I'm guessing. I will have both trilogies done. I have gotten another request via the YouTube comments. Thank you to everyone who gives those requests. I do actually appreciate it. This one asking for the Jesus incident. That I can talk for the Jesus incident by Frank Herbert, which is a good one, and I do have in my collection. My one caveat is that I would like to get through Destination Void before I get to that. Also, I have like 2 other books, at the very least, that people have asked for, and probably some I've forgotten. I know one was Hyperion. That one I know I'm doing. The other was what? Oh, Three Body Problem was the other one. I've got to reread Three Body Problem. I've got to reread the Jesus Incident. I've got to reread Hyperion. The Hyperion Cantos, by author whose name I can't remember right off the top of my head. Simmons, Dan Simmons, John Simmons, something Simmons, Dan Simmons. There we go. Yes, Dan Simmons. So that after we get through these 2 trilogies, I'll probably take a break from reading novels to do some short stories, probably a short story collection. Probably Greg Egan, because I still have 1 or 2 of those to get through that I haven't done on the stream, I should say. I don't think we did Oceanic. I think the last one we did was Luminous. I don't think we did Oceanic. So Oceanic it would probably be, which has some very long short stories that'll have to take at least 2 streams to do in it. Namely, the titular short story Oceanic is a long one. So we'll probably do a break from novels to do that, and then we'll get cracking on the Hyperion Cantos, and then probably the Three Body Problem. I don't know that I'm going to do trilogies one right after the other ever again. I'm not saying I won't do trilogies. I'll absolutely be doing plenty of series. Fret not. So long as I'm able, I will do these things. And God knows I've got enough trilogies floating around to make that happen. But probably not just do them in sequence without gaps doing other things. I like to keep the variety spread out, as it were. I like to keep them spread out for variety's sake. My brain took that sentence and then like hamburgered it. Okay, so that's me. That's me done. I do this every Friday on Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. I do them live in front of a live studio audience composed of whoever's tuning in at the time. Thanks to everyone who does that. Thanks to everyone who tunes in after the fact. I'm 100% happy with anybody watching them, really, because it makes me it's getting that feedback from screaming into the void. It's not just screaming into the void. It's screaming into the void and the void saying, "Oh, hi, how's it going? How's it going? How's it going?" The void, it's very high pitched when it squeals back. So that's how the void do. So you can catch me live at noon Eastern Standard Time is when I start. I try to start streaming. Today was an aberration. This week has been weird. Hopefully that won't continue. Um, yeah. Other than that, I do have a point in time in which I think I've got a week that I'm not going to be around in June, July, yeah, last week of June, I think it is. And then there's another one that I don't think I'm going to be around for in late August. Two points where I'm not going to be in the state. I'm not going to be around to do it. But those are far enough out that I should at least be between books at those 2 points. I believe I've got it planned out. If not, you'll just have to grin and bear it. Sorry, for a week. It's a week. I think people will live. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I think people will live. At any rate, thanks again. Stay safe, stay sane as best you can. Get well soon if you're not doing well. Don't get sick. Don't let us get sick. Don't let us get old. Don't let us get stupid. All right. To quote the uh, to quote Warren Zevon. I think I'm quoting that correctly. Close enough. Anyway, and be decent to each other. Yeah. Careful. You can get crucified talking like that. I've made that joke a lot, and I really shouldn't. It's not all that funny, but it's kind of funny, but it's not that funny. Anyway, see you all later. Thanks again to everyone who tuned in. I do appreciate it. Uh, yeah, and that'll do it. I'm out of sorts today. I don't know what's going on. See you all later. Bye.